morning, and I told them, you're welcome to come over anytime. If all we can do is help feed you naturally, we'll do that. Planting seeds. It's good to have Sister McNabb back. And she's part of our extended family. She's family, but she's in a different place, but she's still family, and she's doing good. Brother Smith and Brother Ayers are in Greenville. They're at the youth meeting / ministers meeting. So I know we miss them, but I'm thankful for all of you, faithful people, and I still say we have a great group of people here. You just put this group up against any other people, and I'd say we would win. So I'm thankful for the people in church here, and I'm really thankful for Brother Smith and his ministry and what he's done, the Word of God that he's put down in our life, the principles, the seeds that he sowed in this church. And now it's kind of fun sitting back and watch those seeds produce fruit. I like it. This morning, with the Lord's help, it may seem like a simple Bible study, but I want to talk a little bit about the difference between trust and faith, and I want to show that trust and peace go hand in hand. You can't have trust without peace, and you can't have peace without trust. It almost sounds like an oxymoron, but it's deep. It's really deep, and without trust and without peace, you won't be able to go very far in your Christian walk with God. And I know faith plays a part of it. And just real quick, I just want to say this about faith, because we always talk about faith. You got to remember this about faith. Faith comes by hearing, and hearing of the Word of God. In other words, what you hear and allow to go down into your heart, not just you, but me, but what we as a church and as a body, as what we hear and we allow the Lord to put it down in our heart, it will bear fruit, and that will produce something. And not only hear, but things that we see. A lot of people say, and there's nothing wrong with this, they say, well, I have faith that I'm going to be healed. But they also say, I trust God that He's going to heal me. Well, they kind of go hand in hand too, but you got to remember this. Faith comes by hearing. A lot of people, when Jesus' first miracle was in Cana, and it's the only place it's recorded is in the book of John. That's where he was at a wedding feast, and he turned water into wine because they had run out. There wasn't very many people that really knew about that. At that time, John the Baptizer was going about Judea and Jerusalem and preaching and baptizing, and Jesus hadn't come into his own yet. He told people, he said, don't say anything about this. My time's not yet. So back in those days, if you weren't one of those servants or one of the 12 that saw Jesus turn the water into wine, and if Jesus came up to you and, well, number one, you really didn't know who he was, so you would not go up to him and say, Lord, could you heal me? Nobody knew about him. But when they started hearing his message and they started seeing what was going on, they saw the dumb spake, the blind saw, the lame walked, the dead were raised, and the gospel was preached to the poor, and people started coming up to him. They heard the message. They may not have understood it fully, but it pointed them in the right direction, saying, hey, he is saying this, and I am seeing this. So that pointed them in the right direction to approach Jesus about their afflictions. Faith is almost like a compass. It will point you in a certain direction. And the more that you learn about God, the more that you start to understand, and it starts to bear fruit, and things that you see with your own eyes, that it's almost like, have you ever had a real cheap compass? I had. I used to be in the Boy Scouts. You'd have to get a real good compass, and when you'd set it down, it would instantly point to the north. But I've had other ones. You'd sit there, and the thing would just swing. It seemed like it would never fully point all the way to the north. It was just a cheap compass. Well, it's kind of pointing you in the right direction that way. A good compass will point you exactly which way to go. A cheaper compass, you're going to have to give it maybe a few minutes to really settle down. But that's kind of how faith is. It's because of what we hear and what we see that causes faith to rise up in our heart. What is faith? Faith will point us. I always, you know me, I like my little sayings. I have one about peace that I use. You know, peace is not the absence of trouble. Rather, peace is the calm assurance from God that we are walking in his ways and he will never put more upon us than what we're able to bear. Well, I have one about faith and trust. And I say this about faith. Faith will point us in the right direction, but trust will keep us on the path. That's what I see as the big difference between faith and trust. Yes, I have faith that God, I've seen people in this church healed. So with what I read in the Bible and what I've seen with my own eyes, I know God can heal people. I've seen it before. We've all, and there may be some of us here that has had that happen to them. That causes faith to rise up in our hearts. And then when we start hearing things on how we live, and even more importantly, what is the end goal of our walk in God? What are we walking toward? And the more we learn about God, that creates that faith or direction in our life, and our life starts to become a pattern after his. We start to walk like Christ. We start to talk like Christ. Not that we are Christ, but, you know, with everything that Jesus said, Brother Painter gave us the Beatitudes here a week or two ago, all those things that we're supposed to do. Why are we supposed to do those things? Because that's how God is. We're supposed to be patient because God's patient. You know, we're supposed to be forgiving because God is forgiving. We're supposed to be all these things because that's God's character. That's why God gave the 10 Commandments and the 613 ordinances to show who he was. God does not want us to lie because he doesn't lie. God doesn't want us to steal because he doesn't steal. God doesn't want to bear, God will not bear false witness because, or we don't bear false witness because God doesn't bear false witness. That's who God is. So when we start to learn more about God and he becomes more and more a center part of our life, we're finally, like Paul said, let that same spirit be in you that was also in Christ Jesus. You can read scriptures like that, and when you first come to God, your compass, your faith, it's swinging all over. You don't know much about God. You haven't seen much of God's workings in your life or even in the church. And so your faith is very limited into this. You may not know exactly. You're hearing that I'm here, and the Lord wants us to become perfect like his son. He wants to have that. He wants us to have that same spirit. He wants us to have that same mind. He wants all those things for us, just like his son. Well, that sounds good, but what does that mean? How do I do that? How do I become like his son? And that's where faith comes in. A lot of people have different ideas of what it is that the end process of our salvation is. The end process of our salvation is eternal life through Jesus Christ our Lord. But people have different ideas how to get there. So the more we learn about God, our compass doesn't swing so much, so to speak. Our faith becomes more steady until finally our compass, our faith points steadily to the goal. And I love that goal. That's life eternal. That's life everlasting. Through that process that we're going through. That's faith. Faith comes by hearing of the Word of God, and seeing. And the same can be true not only with our walk with God, but with God's help, both naturally and spiritually, whether it's on the job or it's on the family or it's on the health. We all pray for God to do things, certain things for us. Well, that's part of faith. We pray that because we know God hears us, and we know through His Word and through testimonies of others and actually seeing and experiencing it ourselves. That's faith. Faith tells us God can and will do that. What is trust? Where does trust come in? That's where I say faith will point you in the right direction, and trust will keep you on that road. And I'm going to explain that a little bit after I take isn't this good coffee this morning? That was a good breakfast, wasn't it? I appreciate those that we have here that labor to make that good breakfast for it. And I pray, and y'all pray that God will bless them, because it's hard because they miss out on Bible studies. So, but God will help them. God will make up the difference. I want to read, and by the way, I forgot my different glasses. So if I have to keep taking these on and off so I can see, if I put these on here, everybody kind of disappears. But I can see what I'm going to read. But if I take my glasses off, y'all reappear, and I can't read what's on my phone. So I'm going to be, some of you older people can understand that a little bit, maybe. I want to read something. Turn to the 3rd chapter of Daniel. By the way, I told Sister Grace this, I wasn't here Wednesday, and I said I really appreciated your testimony, about reading the Bible and everything. My wife and I, we have a ritual. We get up, we're both retired, so we get up in the morning, we drink our coffee, and usually around 7 o'clock, we try to read 45 minutes to an hour from the Bible, and we love it. That's become a part of our lifestyle. I need to read most of this so that you can get what's going on. Number one, the first thing that's real important to know when you read Daniel chapter 3 is that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were carried away by Nebuchadnezzar. In the first, there was 3 carryings away by Nebuchadnezzar. The first, he carried away the king and all the royal seed, the princes and princesses and all these other people that were related to the king, and those that were craftsmen. And after the last carrying away, it said all that was left was the poorest of the poor, and they were to simply be vine dressers. So Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego was in the first carrying away by Nebuchadnezzar, who was the king of Babylon. So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego had already been trained up in the ways of the kingdom, how to counsel the king, how to go in and out before the king. And they were probably very intelligent. Plus, as a Hebrew boy or girl at a certain age, you were required to start learning not only the 10 Commandments, but also you had to know the 613 ordinances and precepts and commandments of the Lord. You had to know all the stories, and by a certain age, most of those young boys and most of those young girls could quote most of the Old Testament themselves, and they knew the consequences of certain sins, like denying that God was who he said he was. That could be punishable by death. So they knew all these stories, but they knew what God required of them and what they could expect from God because of their obedience. They knew all those things. So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and Daniel, in the first carried away, they were found to be fit for the service of King Nebuchadnezzar, and that's another different story. But when we start to read Daniel 3, I want you to know this, that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, because of what had already happened to Daniel, they had been elevated as Jews to a very, very high government position in the kingdom of Babylon under Nebuchadnezzar. So when they spoke, you know, it was, I mean, they had a lot of authority. But they never forgot who their God was and why they were there. And every day, Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego would face toward the east, toward Jerusalem, and they would pray to the God of their fathers. And they knew what God expected out of them. So when we go into this story, we're just not talking about three people, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These are three Hebrew boys that grew up under the Jewish religion, that knew who God was and what God expected out of them, and they knew how to behave before God. And they had already proved that they could follow God. And so they were in high government positions. And it says this: Nebuchadnezzar the king made an image of gold whose height was 80 cubits. That's tall. 80 cubits, that would be what, 90 feet? Something like that. 75 feet of gold. And the breadth thereof 6 cubits. He set it up in the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. Then Nebuchadnezzar the king sent together the princes, the governors, and the captains, the judges, the treasurers, the counselors, the sheriffs, and all the rulers of the provinces to come to the dedication of the image which Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. Then the princes, the governors, the captains, the judges, the treasurers, the counselors, the sheriffs, and all the rulers of the provinces were gathered together onto the dedication of the image that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. And they stood before the image that Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Then a herald cried. We don't know where Daniel was at this time. Daniel was, after Nebuchadnezzar, there was no one that had more authority and position than Daniel in the kingdom of Babylon, but we don't know where he was, or he would have been included with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Then a herald cried aloud, to you it is commanded, O people, nations, and languages, that at what time you hear the sound of the cornet, flute, harp, sackbut, psaltery, dulcimer, and all kinds of music, ye fall down and worship the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar the king has set up. And whoso falleth not down and worship shall the same hour be cast into the midst of a burning fiery furnace. Therefore at that time, when all the people heard the sound of the cornet, flute, harp, sackbut, psaltery, and all kinds of music, all the people, the nations, and the languages fell down and worshiped the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. You got to stop right there. The main commandment, very important to understand is the main commandment and precept, and all that the Jews were raised up for was to recognize, he said this, Hear, O Israel, the Lord thy God is one, and beside me there is no other. They were raised up and they were taught that from a little child until the carrying away. And even when they were carried away, they would still pray to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and of Jacob, because that's what they believed. That was their faith. That's what they saw. That's what they'd been taught, and pointed them in a certain direction. Pray that we have a strong faith or understanding like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Wherefore, at that time, certain Chaldeans who were wise men came near, and they really weren't very wise. They came near and accused the Jews. They spake and said to the king Nebuchadnezzar, O king, live forever. Thou, O king, hast made a decree that every man that shall hear the sound of the cornet, flute, harp, sackbut, psaltery, and dulcimer, by the time we get done with this, you're going to know, you'll have every musical instrument memorized. And all kinds of music shall fall down and worship the golden image. And whoso falleth not down and worshipeth, that he should be cast into the midst of a burning fiery furnace. There are certain Jews, here they're starting to narrow it down, certain Jews whom thou hast set over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These men, O king, have not regarded thee. They serve not thy gods, nor worship the golden image which thou hast set up. Then Nebuchadnezzar, in his rage and fury, commanded to bring Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Then they brought these men before the king. Like I said, the Bible doesn't say where Daniel was. He was probably away on official business, or he would have been there too. Nebuchadnezzar spake and said unto them, Is it true, O Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, do not you serve my gods, nor worship the golden image which I have set up? Now if you be ready, that at what time, are you ready? Can y'all remember this? At what time you hear the sound of the cornet, flute, harp, sackbut, psaltery, and dulcimer. Have you got that memorized? And all kinds of music, you fall down and worship the image which I have made. Well, but if you worship not, you shall be cast the same hour into the midst of a burning fiery furnace. And who is that God? You got to remember, if you go back to the previous chapter, Daniel had already interpreted that dream of Nebuchadnezzar about the golden image. He told him, you, O king, you're that head of gold. And because of that, of what happens in the chapter before, Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were highly elevated in the government of Babylon. And at that time, Nebuchadnezzar also made a proclamation that you got to worship the God of Daniel because he is a revealer of dreams. He is a God of God and Lord of lords. Nebuchadnezzar, you can go back in the first and second chapters and read that. So here, just a short while later, Nebuchadnezzar is wanting everyone to bow down and worship him. So that's where we're at right now. It says, I like this. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we're not careful to answer thee, because they're saying this because they knew Nebuchadnezzar was able to cast them alive into the fiery furnace. So they and plus he was the king, and they were serving the king, not worshiping that they were serving. We are not careful to answer thee in this matter. If it so be, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace. They didn't say he will. He said, if it so be. That just simply means we know our God is able to deliver us from this burning fiery furnace that you've set up for us. This is where trust comes in. This is the difference between faith and trust. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and Daniel's faith said, thou shalt have no other God beside me. That was their faith. That needle on their compass pointed directly north, and they were not going to waver. They weren't going to stray from the direction that faith had pointed them in. And they said, we know that you can cast us in there. And we know, because they knew the stories, they knew all the stories in the Old Testament up until that time. The crossing of the Red Sea, the parting of the water. They knew of the, 187,000 Assyrians that God killed at the gate of Jerusalem in one night to defend Hezekiah. It was either 127,000 or 180. They knew all those stories. And some of this they had seen with their own eyes. They saw how God had used Daniel and that dream of Nebuchadnezzar to elevate those four Hebrews to a position of high authority and power and honor in the kingdom. They saw that with their eyes, and they understood with their heart because what had been put down in there. And they said, we know God can do it. We know God can deliver us out of your hands. But they're also saying, but we don't know if he will or not. Let's go on and read that. If it so be, our God, whom we serve, is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of your hands, O king. But if not, be it known unto thee, O king, that we will not serve thy gods, nor worship the golden image which thou hast set up. I want to stop right here because there's another part of this that is, I'm sure it's been talked about, but if it is, it's rarely talked about. Another part of this story, because of the position, there were tens of thousands. Remember, all that was left in Judah and Benjamin, all that was left was the poorest of the poor to simply dress the vines so that the land wouldn't be overgrown. Everybody else was carried away by Nebuchadnezzar. How many that was? I don't know, but it was a lot of people. It could have been hundreds of thousands of people. And they're all there under Nebuchadnezzar's rule. And now Daniel, who is second to the king, and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who are they're rulers in the land. All those other Jews, all those hundreds of thousands of Jews, because a decree went out throughout the land that whoever was not going to worship this golden image was going to be cast into the fire. So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego weren't the only ones who heard that. You know who else heard it? All those hundreds of thousands of Jews who had been led captive by Nebuchadnezzar and his armies into Babylon. They knew that. And it could be that some of them were there. We don't know. But they probably thought, oh my God, what is going to happen to us? And you know what they did? They looked to see what their leaders were going to do. They wanted to see what men like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were going to do. And when, oh no, thank you, sister, unless they want some here. So they were watching to see what Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego weren't going to do. And when they would not bow down, you know that had to cause. Sometimes our compass gets shaky is what I'm saying. And no doubt at that time, some of the Jews, you know, probably their faith compass was probably swinging like a cheap compass. They didn't know what to do. What are we going to do? You know, God brought us here, and now we're all going to die. But they look to their, and sometimes we have to do that same thing in our lives. Sometimes we look to those around us, even those that are in a position of authority and leadership, and they can be a stabilizing factor in our lives, just like, no doubt, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego was a stabilizing factor to all those Jews back there. And they would not bow down, nor would they worship the gods of Nebuchadnezzar. And that held them. And sometimes we need that. Thank God for brothers and sisters. You know, we look around in this church, and I look at people like Brother Talley. Brother Talley just recently, he went through cancer. And so I saw how he went through it. We all prayed for a long time, Brother Talley, that God would heal you of that cancer. But you had to go through that chemo. But your faith was saying, I have seen other people healed, and I know God can heal me. But if he does not, my faith compass is not going to go. And he didn't miss services. God helped him. he had to go through the chemotherapy. To me, that's an example. So I want to use that as an example. He's a leader in his church. So we can use him as an example of what it is to be faithful in God, even though, and he was trusting God. Brother Tally and I, we've spent many hours together going to visit people and stuff, and we became friends, and we got to know one another. And I know he trusted God. I know that beyond a shadow of a doubt. And he prayed that God would touch him. But he didn't know if God would. He knew that God could. That's where trust is. Faith will point you in the right direction, and trust will keep you on that path. When your moral compass, just like we know the story, because I'm going to run out of time. We know the story. We know the story of what happened to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. God did deliver them. But I want to show you, we never go down to the very bottom. Go down, I think it's to the very bottom, because of what was put in the hearts of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and their faith in God. They trusted God. We know God can deliver us, but we don't know if he will. But I want to show you what happened. Read down a little bit here. Okay. In verse 28, then, this is why we need strong leaders. Strong example. I picked out Brother Tally because he's just the most recent example. There's many of others in this church, you know, financially, physically, spiritually, family-wise, job-wise, that have been leaders in this church because their faith pointed them in the right direction, and they were going to do the right thing. They may not know while they're going through it, they may not know the end result of it, but they know that I cannot turn my back on God. I cannot deny the faith that's been put down in my heart. I cannot let my faith compass start swinging all over the place. My faith compass is, or the direction that God is pointing me in, is going to be steady. How I get there, it's up to God. God's going to, God's going to make sure I get to that other side. And that's the nice thing about God. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, I don't know how much they knew about resurrections like in Matthew 27:52, but they said, we know that God will deliver us out of your hands one way or another, whether it be by God delivering them out of the fiery furnace or whether they go through it. They had a hope. Like I say, I don't know how much they knew about resurrection in Matthew 27:52, but they had a hope that God had something better for us. I just have to believe that. So that was their compass. So let's read this. This is what happens in a church when you have strong. I'm not just talking about muscle strong. That sure wouldn't be me. Maybe at one time I was be considered stout. Years ago when Brother Mark first came to the church in Republic, we used to wrestle. Remember that, Brother Mark? He was pretty stout, and I was older than him, and sometimes he could whoop me, and sometimes I could whoop him. I'd go up to him, and I'd sneak up behind him, I'd pick him up off the ground, and I'd shake him, and I can't do that anymore. I'm not talking about that kind of strong. I'm talking about strong in the faith, the direction that God has pointed us in, the strong in our belief and our faith and our trust in God. And when we have strong leaders, men and women in this church and in the body, we become unshakable. We become unmovable. We become one where our faith compass always points directly to the north. It doesn't vary at all because we know what the goal is, and we'll be like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and they said, God can deliver us, but if he doesn't, we're still not going to bow down and worship these gods. We don't know what we're going to go through. Let me finish this real quick. It said, then Nebuchadnezzar spake After the 3 Hebrew children came out of the fire without the smell of smoke on them, and Nebuchadnezzar also saw a 4th person in there, like unto the Son of God, said, then Nebuchadnezzar spake, and I like this. This is what happens when you become strong in the Lord, when your faith is unshakable, unmovable, when you trust God and you go through things. And everybody here, guess what? You're either fixing to go through something, you're in the middle of something, or you're coming out of something. That never changes. That's part of God's process. But how do we go through it? We know the direction, but do we know what God's going to do? We know God can, but we don't know what God will do. It says this, then Nebuchadnezzar spake and said, blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and delivered his servants that trusted, that's the word right here, that trusted in him, and have changed the king's word, and yielded their bodies, that they might not serve nor worship any god except their own God. Therefore I make a decree that every people, nation, and language, no musical instruments this time, brother, to every people, nation, and language which speak anything amiss against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be cut in pieces, and their houses shall be made a dunghill, because there is no other God that can deliver after this sort. I love that. I love that. So Shadrach, Nebuchadnezzar made a decree that nobody's going to worship any other God except the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. I see that as a difference between faith and trust. I got a few minutes. I've told this stories before, but it helps to illustrate the difference between faith and trust. For years and years after I came to this body, I saw people healed. I did. I saw people healed in meetings, and I heard about, what Jesus did in the New Testament, and I started to hear what God would do for us, and my compass started pointing north. So I started living for God, and God pointed me in the right direction. Remember, faith will point you in the right direction, but trust will keep you on that road. It will keep you on that journey. So for years and years, it was easy to trust God. It really wasn't easy, because what my wife and I went through, God did miraculous things for us. With the 3 years we were in Texas, God greatly helped us. And that helped build faith in my life that God could take care of our natural needs. Goodness, if I was to tell you some of the things that happened to us, you would just call it miraculous, those 3 years that God did for us. But we started to hear the Word of God, and it started to go down in our hearts and bear fruit. Well, it was 11 years ago, and I've seen people healed. I've even prayed for people who were healed. Imagine that. Prayed for people that were healed. Not because of me, but it's because of who God is. God is just good, and He wants to help His children. I came home from y'all know the story, I'm going to make it quick. I came home from church and passed out on the bed, and that's when I had my, what they call subarachnoid hemorrhage, which was an aneurysm in the brain. It went poof like that, and I passed out. And so I got up. In fact, you probably don't know it. One of these days I'll play you for it. I turned out so good. It's just God's help. I turned out so good that for Aneurysm Awareness Month, my doctor wanted me to be interviewed on air by a Little Rock news station. I didn't want to do it. And finally, the doctor's office kept calling me, and so I did. So they came to my place of work, and they interviewed me for 45 minutes. I got it on my phone, and they condensed it down to 1 minute and 49 seconds. Me, right there where I work, you know. And they cut all mentions of God out of it, as I talk a lot about God and what He did for me. But they cut that out. But anyway, you know the story. I ended up, and I was out of it for 5 or 6 days. People came to visit me in the hospital, and I have no memory before or 5 days after the surgery. I didn't know anything. In fact, when I was there, my son Aaron, he came from Springfield, and he was sitting there with me. And I'm actually glad I did this. They say when you're under deep anesthesia or you're having problems, brain problems, which they wouldn't give me pain medication for a while to see if my brain was still functioning. I still don't know if it's functioning, Brother Mark. I got my doubts. I don't know. I don't know if it's functioning or not. But Aaron was sitting there with me, and I don't know how many days this was after my initial surgery, but I don't remember any of it. I was sitting there with Aaron, and this nurse came in, and she said, this is what Aaron said. He said, Mr. Durham, can I get you anything? And there's two things. There's a couple different ways that people respond to things like this. They either become mean or they become kind of sweet and silly. I became kind of sweet and silly. So I don't remember saying this, but I looked at the nurse, and she said, is there anything I can get you? And I said, yes. She said, what is it? I said, I want a rubber parrot and an eye patch. She said, you want a rubber parrot and an eye patch? And I said, yes, I'm a pirate. And because my face was all swollen, I guess. And then apparently this was a young, good-looking nurse. And my son Aaron, at that time, he wasn't married. He's young and good-looking. And I said, are you married? And she said, no. I said, good, neither's my son. Why don't you two go out together? So I always felt good after that because I was always worried, would I be one of those mean people? But anyway, I came home after 8 days of that. And by this time, I already, I was home one day. I came home on a Saturday. And then I went to church that Sunday. And then the next morning, I had a certain type of stroke that is unique. Only 3% of strokes are what they call hemorrhagic strokes. It's caused by bleeding on the brain. 97% of strokes are caused by blockages in your artery. Well, 3% is caused by a hemorrhage in your brain. And what happens is the arteries loves blood on the inside, but if it's outside, it irritates the arteries and they constrict into a type of a stroke. It does the same thing as the other type of stroke, but different. So I went back in for 7 or 8 more days, and I had that stroke. And that's where I got some of my deficits, you know. I never did, Sister Donna, I never did lose my good looks. You know, I never did do that, but I do have some neurological defects. Sometimes, you know, my speech, I have aphasia, and I have different things and that I've had to deal with over the years. But during this time, they also told me that there was that subarachnoid hemorrhage was on my left side, and there was 2 aneurysms, one large, very large, another one small over here. And guess what? There was one over here on the right side. So they told me, finally, I'm not going to go into my testimony, what happened when I had, it's called vasospasm, that hemorrhagic stroke. I pray that none of you ever have to go through that. That was terrible. But I finally made it home, and I knew I was going to be off work for 3 months so I could recover. And I still didn't know if I was going to be able to go back to work. But they told me, they said, you have a third aneurysm on that right side, and we need to set you up for a time of operation to go ahead and take care of that. And I said, okay, because what I just come through, I did not want to go through again. And so they set me up, and as I got closer and I got closer and I got closer to that time of having to go in for my second brain surgery, the Lord started dealing with me. And he did talk to me once. He said, don't worry, son, I got your back. He didn't talk to me, but he started dealing with my spirit. You say you trust God. Why, this is my terms. How do they say it? Put your money where your mouth is. Let's just, I felt like God wanted me to forego that surgery, even though I knew what the consequences were when it ruptured. So I prayed, and I talked to my wife. I even went and counseled with Brother Smith. And so ultimately, I went back in for for another CT scan, and I asked the doctor. I said, is it? And it was a small aneurysm. I said, do you feel like that? Because they're doing a CT scan. Well, was it every 3 months for a while, and every 6 months, something like that? I said, do you feel like you could catch it before it gets larger on this side and it becomes a problem or even ruptures? He said, I think we can, but there's no guarantee. So I really prayed about it. I searched my heart, and I felt like I needed to trust God. I knew God could heal. I've seen people healed. God's even touched me. All these things. I knew God could do it. But God was doing something. God was steadying my faith compass. He was taking more of the wiggle out of the faith compass, you might want to say. So I called the doctor up and I said, I'm not going to have the surgery. He said, in fact, it was getting so close to the surgery, I went to the pre-op surgery. That's where they determine if you're capable of surviving a surgery. And they said, you're capable. So anyway, I went back to work, knowing, and then every day I'd get up, and I knew that I had this aneurysm over here, because they would do a CT scan, a CAT scan, and it was still there. I prayed about it, the church prayed about it, everybody prayed about it, but it never changed, and it never changed in size. So it went from every 3 months to every 6 months, and that went on for 3 years. Every day I would get up thinking, God, I know this thing is in my head, and if it ruptures, it's a bad deal. But Lord, I feel like I need to trust you. I don't know if you're going to heal this or not. I know you can, but I don't know if you will. But right now, I'm trusting you. We all go through circumstances, whether it's individual or family or church or even the body, that we don't know what the end result's going to be. We don't know. But our moral compass, or I should say our faith compass, doesn't move, and we know where we're going to end up. We don't know how God is going to get us from here to there, or what we're going to have to go through. But we know that we still trust God. One of my favorite songs is that we sing in church once in a while. It says, I still trust you, Lord. I still trust you. And every once in a while I play that. So anyway, after 3 years, I told my wife, I said, I feel like I need to have this surgery. This after 3 years, and every day I'd get up, Brother Fisher, and I'd say, this could be the day that ruptures, but I'm trusting you, God. You say, well, you didn't have peace. I did have peace because I lived by this principle. Because most people, when they find out they have one aneurysm that hasn't ruptured, most everybody has that taken care of. And for sure, if you've gone one that's already ruptured, you're not going to, if there are people out there, and there are a few that go through that decide to forego surgery after a ruptured aneurysm, they're usually on medicines to calm their anxiety. You know, it's like you're going around with a time bomb in your head. But I was trusting God. So I had peace. Those 3 years, I had peace. And I never lost my faith in God. I'd get up and I'd pray. I'd say, God, you know. And God would help me through the day. Remember, peace and trust walk hand in hand. Trust says, you don't know what you're going to run into. But peace says, peace is not the absence of trouble. Rather, peace is the calm assurance from God that you're walking in his ways, and he will never put more upon you than what that you're able to bear. And I felt that I was able to bear this because I was walking in God's ways. So I went into the doctor and I talked to him, and so they did another CT scan. He said, it really hasn't changed, but we'll go ahead and, we'll do it. This time, the first time I remember nothing about the surgery room or anything like that, but because I wasn't aware of what was going on. But this time, when they rolled me into the surgery room, I thought, my goodness, I look like I'm in a carpenter's workshop. They had drills, and they had saws, and they had screwdrivers, and I'm thinking, oh my. So God helped me through it. And of course it was successful, but the doctor came out and told my wife, he says, it's so good that your husband opted to have this surgery. See, on a CAT scan, it's like an x-ray, poof. And it just shows you right at that instant something. Well, when they got in there and they started operating on this side, they said your husband's aneurysm, every time his heart would beat, the aneurysm would pulse. And that means it's fixing the poof. So, but God, for 3 years, I felt comfortable in trusting God. But then all of a sudden, God says, well, you may want to think about getting that. Could God have healed me? Could God have done something? Yes. But God, for some reason, whatever, I don't question him, he allowed me to go through that second surgery, and I came out okay. That's trust. And that's what we're trying to develop as an individual, as a family, as a church, and as a body is we know we're going in the right direction. Sometimes our faith compass may swing a little to the left or a little to the right, but we know where we're going, and we know it's the right place to go. We don't know what's going to happen to us on that road, Brother Fisher. We don't know. But we know that God, we can trust God because he's never failed us yet. And I'm out of time. So thank you for listening to me, and God bless y'all. We'll see y'all upstairs. Thank you.